7-year-old Lily Chun pressed her small face against the cold chain-link fence, her breath forming tiny clouds in the crisp October air. The annual Riverside Park community picnic buzzed with laughter and chatter behind her, but all she could hear were the haunting howls that seemed to echo from the depths of hell itself. Her foster parents, the Johnsons, were busy manning their barbecue booth, completely unaware that their newest placement had wandered away from the safety of the crowd. The abandoned Riverside Military K-9 training facility loomed before her, like something from a nightmare. Rust-stained concrete walls stretched 15 feet high, topped with coils of razor wire that gleamed menacingly in the afternoon sun. Weeds pushed through cracks in the pavement, and graffiti covered every available surface. But it was the sounds coming from within that made Lily's heart race deep. Guttural growls punctuated by bone-chilling howls that seemed to speak of unspeakable pain and rage. A weathered sign hung crookily on the fence. Danger. Authorized. Personnel, only trespassers will be prosecuted. Below it, someone had spray-painted in blood-red letters, the death PE and enter and die. Local teenagers dared each other to touch the fence on Halloween, but nobody was brave enough to actually go inside. Even the police avoided this place. Lily had heard the whispered stories at her new elementary school. 14 German shepherds lived inside former military working dogs who had seen too much combat, experienced too much trauma. They had been brought here 3 years ago after being deemed unfit for civilian life. The army had planned to euthanize them, but animal rights activists intervened, demanding they be given a chance at rehabilitation. The compromise was this isolated facility where the dogs could live out their days away from society. But rehabilitation had failed spectacularly. These weren't ordinary pets who could be retrained with treats and patience. These were battle-hardened warriors whose minds had been shattered by the horrors of war. They had witnessed their human handlers die in explosions, had been trained to kill on command, had survived firefights that would break most people. Trust had been systematically beaten out of them by years of violence and loss. Animal Control Officer Jake Martinez had tried everything. Professional dog trainers, animal behaviorists, veterinary psychiatrists, all had given up within days. The dogs attacked anyone who entered their domain, working together with military precision. They had formed a pack with their own hierarchy, their own rules, their own justice. The facility had become their territory, and they defended it with deadly efficiency. The howling grew louder, more desperate. Lily's small hands gripped the fence as she peered through the gaps. In the distance, she could see shadows moving between the concrete buildings, large, powerful shapes that moved with predatory grace. Her foster mother had told her about dogs like these during one of their bedtime conversations about Lily's biological mother, who had been killed by a drunk driver when Lily was 4. "Your mama loved animals," Mrs. Johnson had said softly. She used to sing to the neighborhood strays, and somehow they always became gentle around her. She had a gift. Lily touched the silver locket around her neck, the only thing she had left of her mother. Inside was a tiny photo, and her mother's handwritten lyrics to a lullaby she used to sing. As if drawn by some invisible force, Lily began walking along the fence line. The picnic sounds faded behind her as she moved deeper into the overgrown area surrounding the facility. Thorns caught at her yellow sundress, and mud squelched beneath her sneakers, but she pressed on. Something was calling her, not the howls, but something deeper. A need she couldn't understand. She found it 50 yards from the main gate, a hole in the fence where time and weather had corroded the metal. The opening was barely large enough for a child to squeeze through, invisible, unless you knew exactly where to look. Lily crouched down, her heart hammering as she stared into the forbidden zone. The concrete courtyard stretched out before her, cracked and stained with years of neglect. Abandoned training equipment lay scattered about tire obstacles, wooden walls, metal tunnels that had once been used to teach dogs to navigate battlefield conditions. But it was the building in the center that drew our attention. Long and low, with barred windows, it looked more like a prison than a home. And then she saw them. 14 pairs of amber eyes watched her from the shadows of the building's overhang. Massive German shepherds, each one weighing at least 90 pounds, their coats matted and scarred from years of living wild. They stood perfectly still, like statues carved from muscle and fury. Even from this distance, Lily could see the intelligence. In their gaze, not the simple awareness of ordinary dogs, but the sharp, calculating stare of predators who had learned to survive in a world of violence. The largest dog stepped forward slightly. His black and tan coat was crossed with pale scars, and his left ear was partially missing. This was Rex, though Lily didn't know his name yet. This was the pack leader, the one who made the life-or-death decisions for his family of broken warriors. His yellow eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that should have sent her running. Instead, Lily Chun took a deep breath, squeezed through the hole in the fence, and stepped into the death pen. The moment her small sneakers touched the cracked concrete, every dog's posture changed. Heads lifted, muscles tensed, the shadows seemed to shift as 14 killing machines prepared for what they had been trained to do, best eliminate threats to their territory. But Lily felt no fear, only a strange sense of coming home. The moment Lily's sneakers made contact with the concrete, time seemed to freeze. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the oppressive silence, a soft squeak of rubber against stone that might as well have been a declaration of war. Every muscle in every dog's body went rigid, their training kicking in with military precision. These weren't household pets reacting to an unexpected visitor. These were weapons, finely tuned instruments of destruction, whose instincts had been honed by years of combat in the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan. Rex, the pack leader, lifted his massive head and released a growl that seemed to rise from the very depths of hell. The sound was unlike anything Lily had ever heard, not the warning bark of a neighborhood dog, but something primal and deadly that made her bones vibrate. His lips peeled back to reveal canine teeth as long as her fingers, stained yellow from years of tearing through enemies, both human and animal. The other 13 dogs responded instantly to their alpha's signal, emerging from their hiding places. Like shadows given form, they moved with the choreographed precision of a military unit, each dog knowing exactly where to position themselves without a single bark or whine of communication. These animals had spent years perfecting the art of tactical encirclement on real battlefields, where a single mistake meant death not just for themselves, but for their human handlers. Now that same lethal expertise was being deployed against a 7-year-old girl in a yellow sundress. Lily's eyes darted frantically from one dog to another as they took their positions. There was Saber, a sleek black female whose right rear leg bore the twisted scars of an IED explosion that had killed her handler, Sergeant Martinez. She moved with a slight limp, but her amber eyes burned with an intelligence that was both beautiful and terrifying. Next to her prowled Tank, a massive male whose face was a road map of battle scars, a missing chunk from his left ear, a pale line across his muzzle where shrapnel had nearly taken his eye, and a distinctive patch of white fur where burns had damaged his coat beyond repair. Each dog carried the physical and psychological wounds of war. Ghost earned his name for his ability to move silently through enemy territory, appearing and disappearing like smoke. His pale gray coat was perfect camouflage, and his yellow eyes seemed to look right through you to your very soul. Bullet had taken actual gunfire to protect his unit during a Taliban ambush, the scars on his shoulder and flank telling a story of heroism that would never be properly honored. Viper was smaller than the others, but twice as quick, her specialty being the lightning-fast takedown of fleeing enemies. The circle tightened with methodical precision. 10 feet, 8 feet, 6 feet. Lily could smell them now, not the pleasant scent of a well-groomed pet, but the wild, musky odor of predators who had lived rough for 3 years. Their coats were matted with dirt and debris, their claws grown long from constant use on concrete and stone. These weren't dogs anymore in any conventional sense. They were survivors, a pack of apex predators who had learned to trust only each other. Rex took another step forward, his massive paws making no sound despite his 110-pound frame. His scarred face was a mask of cold calculation as he studied the small intruder. In Afghanistan, he had been trained to identify threats. At a distance of 50 meters, he could detect hidden explosives by scent alone, track enemy combatants across miles of hostile territory, and take down a full-grown man with surgical precision. The child before him registered as something his conditioning couldn't categorize. Too small to be a soldier, too young to be a terrorist, but undeniably human, and humans had brought nothing but pain and betrayal to his pack. Behind Rex, the other dogs shifted restlessly, waiting for the command that would end this standoff. They remembered the last human who had entered their territory, well-meaning animal behaviorist named Dr. Patricia Holmes, who had lasted exactly 47 seconds before fleeing with deep puncture wounds on both arms. Before her, there had been animal control officers with tranquilizer guns, military veterinarians with sedatives, and even a famous dog whisperer whose confidence had evaporated the moment he saw Rex's cold stare. Lily's heart hammered against her ribs so hard she was sure the dogs could hear it. Her foster parents were probably looking for her now, calling her name at the picnic, checking behind trees and playground equipment. They had no idea she was trapped in the most dangerous place in the entire county, surrounded by animals that local police wouldn't even attempt to capture anymore. The state had written these dogs off as a necessary evil too dangerous to rehabilitate, too politically sensitive to euthanize, destined to live out their days in this concrete purgatory until old age finally claimed them. The closest dog was now just 4 feet away, close enough that Lily could see every detail of his battle scars. This was Phantom, a dog who had survived 3 tours of duty and watched 4 different handlers die in combat. His right eye was milky white from an old injury, but his left eye burned with an intensity that seemed to pierce straight through her. She could see his muscles bunching beneath his scarred coat, preparing for the final lunge that would end everything. There was no escape. The circle was perfect, the dogs positioned to prevent any possible retreat. Even if she could somehow slip past one, the others would be on her instantly. She was trapped in the center of a killing machine that had been forged in the fires of war and tempered by years of abandonment and betrayal. Rex's growl deepened, becoming a sound that seemed to rise from the earth itself. His amber eyes never left hers as he prepared to give the final command that would unleash 14 war machines on one small, terrified girl who had made the fatal mistake of entering their domain. Rex's massive head lowered into attack position, his shoulder blades shifting beneath his scarred coat as ancient predatory instincts merged with years of military conditioning. The pack leader's yellow eyes had transformed from merely calculating to something far more dangerous. They now held the cold fire of a warrior who had made his decision. Death was coming to the death pen, and it wore the face of a 7-year-old girl in a torn yellow sundress. The other 13 dogs responded to their alpha's subtle body language with the synchronized precision of a Swiss watch. This was the moment they had trained for in the killing fields of Afghanistan, the final approach, when stealth gave way to overwhelming force. Saber's damaged rear leg tensed despite the old shrapnel wounds, her muscles coiling like a spring loaded with lethal potential. Tank's massive frame shifted forward, his 120 pounds of battle-hardened muscle, moving with surprising grace for such a large animal. Ghost seemed to fade into the shadows even in broad daylight, becoming more suggestion than substance as he prepared to strike from an unexpected angle. Lily stood frozen in the center of their tightening noose, her small hands clenched into fists at her sides. She could smell their wild scent, now not just the musky odor of unwashed animals, but something deeper and more primal. It was this smell of violence, of creatures who had survived by becoming harder and more ruthless than their enemies. These weren't the friendly dogs from picture books or family movies. These were apex predators, whose souls had been forged in the crucible of war and tempered by 3 years of abandonment. The concrete beneath their paws told its own story of violence. Dark stains marked spots where previous intruders had learned too late that this territory belonged to the pack. Animal Control Officer Martinez still bore the scars from his last attempt to tranquilize Rex. Deep puncture wounds that had required 47 stitches and left him with permanent nerve damage in his left arm. Dr. Patricia Holmes, the renowned animal behaviorist, had fled screaming after Tank had demonstrated exactly why rehabilitation was impossible for dogs like these. But those previous victims had been adults, people who understood danger, who possessed the survival instincts to recognize death when it stared them in the face. Lily was just a child, innocent in ways that made her both more vulnerable and somehow more dangerous to the pack's psychological stability. Children meant something different in the dog's traumatized minds. Memories of Afghan villages where youngsters had been used as shields by Taliban fighters, where the line between innocent and enemy had been deliberately blurred until paranoia became the only rational response. Rex's lips peeled back further, revealing not just his killing teeth, but the blackened interior of his mouth. His tongue, scarred from an explosion that had killed his first handler, lolled slightly as his breathing deepened. The pack leader's chest rose and fell with controlled rhythm, not the panting of excitement, but the measured breathing of a professional killer preparing for work. His ears, what remained of them after 3 tours of combat, swiveled constantly, monitoring every sound in his territory, while his eyes remained locked on the target. 3 feet now, close enough that Lily could see the individual scars that crisscrossed Rex's muzzle like a roadmap of violence. Close enough to distinguish the different shades of amber in his predatory gaze, gold near the pupils, fading to honey at the edges, with flecks of brown that spoke of genetics, mixed with something harder than DNA. Close enough to see the small notch in his left canine tooth, earned when he had bitten through a piece of shrapnel to save his handler's life. In a moment of heroism that would never be recorded in any official history. The other dogs moved in perfect coordination, their spacing maintained with mathematical precision. This wasn't random pack behavior. This was military tactics applied with lethal efficiency. Viper had positioned herself to cut off any retreat. Toward the fence, Bullet blocked the path to the main building. Ghost had somehow become invisible in plain sight, ready to appear wherever Lily might try to dodge. They had done this before, in places where the stakes were life and death, not just for them, but for entire squads of American soldiers, depending on their success. Phantom's one good eye tracked Lily's every micro-movement, while his blind eye seemed to stare into some unseen dimension of pain. The explosion that had stolen his sight had also taken his handler, Corporal Jennifer Walsh, a 22-year-old from Nebraska who had joined the Army to pay for college and ended up scattered across 50 yards of Afghan mountainside. The guilt of surviving when his human had driven Phantom deeper into madness than any of the others, making him perhaps the most unpredictable member of the pack. 2 feet. Lily could feel Rex's breath now, hot and carrying the scent of all. Raw meat and something metallic that might have been old blood. His massive head was level with her chest, close enough that she could count the gray hairs. mixing with the black around his muzzle, signs of premature aging brought on by years of hypervigilance and trauma. His yellow eyes never blinked, never wavered, locked onto hers with the intensity of a creature that had learned to read death in the faces of enemies across a dozen battlefields. The pack's formation was perfect now, a killing circle with no gaps, no weaknesses, no possibility of escape. 14 war machines, each weighing between 70 and 120 pounds, each trained to kill efficiently and without hesitation, each carrying the psychological scars of betrayal and abandonment that had transformed them from man's best friend into something far more dangerous. Rex's growl deepened to a frequency that seemed to vibrate through the concrete itself, a sound that spoke of finality and inevitability. His muscles bunched for the final lunge, and Lily Chun realized with crystal clarity that she was about to die. In that crystalline moment between life and death, when Rex's muscles coiled for the final strike, and 14 pairs of amber eyes burned with lethal intent, something extraordinary happened inside Lily Chun's 7-year-old mind. Time seemed to stretch like warm honey, each heartbeat lasting an eternity, as her brain processed the impossible situation with startling clarity. She could die here, torn apart by war machines that had forgotten how to be anything but killers. Or she could choose something else entirely. The logical response would have been to scream. Every survival instinct inherited from millions of years of human evolution demanded that she cry out in terror, run blindly toward any gap in their formation, or collapse into a sobbing heap and wait for the inevitable. But Lily had never been a logical child. Born to a mother who sang lullabies to stray cats and a father she'd never known. Raised in a series of foster homes where adaptability meant survival, she had learned to trust her instincts even when they made no sense to anyone else. As Rex's lips pulled back to reveal his killing fangs, as the other dogs tensed for coordinated attack, as the very air seemed to crackle with impending violence, Lily made the most illogical decision of her young life. She slowly, deliberately, lowered herself to her knees on the cold concrete, her yellow sundress spreading around her like fallen sunshine. The movement was so unexpected, so contrary to every defensive behavior the dogs had been trained to anticipate, that it actually caused Rex to hesitate mid-lunge. But Lily wasn't finished with her impossible gamble. As 14 confused predators watched in stunned silence, she folded her small hands in her lap, tilted her head back to look directly into Rex's scarred face, and began to sing. Not a scream, not a plea for mercy, not the terrified babbling of a doomed child, but a lullaby. Her mother's lullaby. Hush now, don't you cry. Everything will be all right. The words floated across the concrete wasteland like something from another world entirely. Lily's voice, pure and clear despite her fear, carried a melody that had been passed down through generations of Chun women Chinese immigrants who had sung their children to sleep in tenement buildings during the Great Depression, through world wars and personal tragedies. It was a song of comfort, of safety, of unconditional love offered without expectation of return. Rex froze completely, his massive body locked in an attack posture that would never be completed. His yellow eyes, which had been burning with predatory fire just seconds before, began to flicker with something else: confusion, recognition, perhaps even a glimmer of the gentle soul that war had buried beneath layers of trauma and survival instinct. His scarred ears, or what remained of them, twitched forward as if straining to capture every note. The effect on the other dogs was equally dramatic. Saber's damaged leg, which had been coiled to spring despite her injuries, slowly relaxed until she was standing normally for the first time in months. Tank's massive head tilted slightly, his aggressive stance softening as ancient memories stirred. In his traumatized mind, Ghost materialized from the shadows where he had been preparing to strike, his pale gray form becoming solid and vulnerable as he listened to sounds he had not heard since puppyhood. Rockabye baby, in the treetop, ... When the wind blows, the cradle will rock, ... Lily's voice grew stronger as she realized the miracle that was unfolding around her. These weren't just military weapons anymore. They were creatures in pain, lost souls who had forgotten what gentleness sounded like. Her mother had always said that music was a universal language, that love could be communicated across any barrier, if you just knew the right frequency. Now, surrounded by death-given canine form, Lily was proving her mother's wisdom with every note. One by one, the dogs began to lower themselves to the ground. Not in submission, they were still alert, still wary, but in something deeper than mere posture change. It was as if the song was unlocking doors in their minds that had been welded shut by years of violence and betrayal. Phantoms won good. I began to blink slowly, no longer the rapid-fire assessment of a combat veteran, but the peaceful rhythm of a creature being soothed. Bullet-scarred shoulders relaxed for the first time since the IED explosion that had nearly killed him. The transformation was not instant or magical, it was gradual, fought against by every survival instinct these animals possessed. Bodies trembled with the conflict between what their training demanded and what their souls remembered. They were war machines trying to remember how to be dogs, predators attempting to recall what it felt like to trust, killers struggling to access the capacity for gentleness that boot camp and battlefield trauma had buried so deeply they thought it was gone forever. When the bow breaks, the cradle will fall, and down will come baby, cradle, and all. Even as she sang, Lily understood on some instinctive level what was happening. These dogs weren't evil, they were broken. Shattered by experiences creatures should have to endure, abandoned by the very system that had created them, left to survive in a concrete wasteland with nothing but each other and their deadly training. They had become killers, not because they wanted to, but because it was the only way they knew how to protect themselves and their pack family. Rex was the last to surrender to the spell of her lullaby. As the pack leader, he carried the greatest burden of responsibility, the heaviest weight of suspicion and paranoia. But even his iron will began to crack as Lily's voice washed over him like warm water over frozen ground. His massive body, which had been coiled for the killing strike just moments before, began to settle toward the concrete as decades of genetic programming older than warfare finally began to reassert itself. The death pen had become something else entirely, a sanctuary where the impossible was quietly, gently, miraculously taking place. What happened next would be talked about in hushed whispers for decades to come, dismissed by skeptics as impossible and celebrated by believers as proof that miracles still occurred in the modern world. Rex, a 110-pound killing machine who had survived 3 tours in Afghanistan and countless battles with would-be intruders, slowly lowered his massive scarred head until his muzzle touched the cold concrete in front of Lily's knees. It was not submission. It was something far more profound. The pack leader, whose yellow eyes had never shown weakness or vulnerability to any living creature since his handler's death, was offering trust to a 7-year-old girl whose only weapon was her mother's lullaby. His enormous body, crisscrossed with battle scars and hardened by years of survival, began to tremble, not with aggression or fear, but with the overwhelming release of emotions he had kept locked away for so long that he had forgotten they existed. The other 13 dogs watched their alpha's transformation with a mixture of confusion and desperate hope. In their rigid military hierarchy, Rex's behavior was unprecedented. Pack leaders didn't show vulnerability. Alphas didn't surrender to strangers. War dogs didn't remember how to be gentle. Yet here was their invincible commander, the dog who had single-handedly killed 3 Taliban fighters to protect his fallen handler, melting under the influence of a child song like, ice in summer sunshine. Saber was the next to surrender. The sleek black female, whose right rear leg bore the twisted metal fragments of an IED that had claimed Sergeant Martinez's life, crawled forward on her belly until she could rest her head against Lily's side. The physical contact the first. Gentle human touch she had experienced in 3 years caused her entire body to shudder with a mixture of joy and disbelief. Tears, actual tears, began to flow from her amber eyes as decades of genetic programming finally overpowered the trauma that had defined her existence. Tank followed, his massive 120-pound frame moving with surprising delicacy. As he positioned himself at Lily's other side, the scars across his face, souvenirs from a mortar attack that had left him the sole survivor of his unit, seemed to soften as he pressed his damaged muzzle against her small hand. For the first time since that horrible day in the Hindu Kush Mountains, Tank allowed himself to remember what safety felt like, what it meant to trust another living being completely. Ghost materialized from the shadows where he had been preparing to strike, his pale gray coat making him appear ethereal in the afternoon light. The dog who had earned his nickname by moving unseen through enemy territory now made himself utterly visible, utterly vulnerable. As he joined the growing circle around Lily, his scarred flanks heaved with emotion as he experienced something he thought he had lost forever, the simple joy of being near a human who wanted nothing from him except his company. One by one, the remaining dogs abandoned their attack positions and drew closer to the singing girl. Bullet, whose shoulder bore the permanent evidence of Taliban gunfire, pressed his massive head against her leg and closed his eyes for the first time in years without scanning for threats. Viper, the smallest but quickest of the pack, curled up near Lily's feet like an oversized puppy, her battle-hardened exterior cracking to reveal the gentle soul underneath. Phantom was the most dramatic transformation of all. The dog whose blind eye had seen nothing but darkness since losing his. Handler, in an explosion slowly, carefully, placed his head in Lily's lap. His one good eye, which had burned with paranoia and rage for 3 years, now gazed up at her with an expression of pure adoration. The anger that had consumed him since Corporal Walsh's death began to drain away like poison leaving a wound, replaced by something clean and healing. As Lily continued to sing, her voice growing stronger with each verse, something magical happened to the concrete wasteland around them. The death pen, which had echoed with howls of rage and pain for 3 years, began to fill with different sounds: contented sighs, gentle whimpers of joy, and the soft snuffling of dogs who were finally truly relaxed for the first time since leaving puppyhood. The transformation went deeper than mere behavior. Years of hypervigilance melted away as 14 war-torn minds finally allowed themselves to experience peace. Muscles that had been rigid with constant tension began to unknot. Breathing patterns that had been shallow and rapid, the respiratory signature of chronic stress, deepened into the slow, rhythmic cycles of genuine rest. Even their scent began to change, the sharp musk of fear and aggression giving way to something warmer and more familiar. Lily's lullaby seemed to unlock memories that predated their military training, reaching back to those precious early months when they had been ordinary puppies with ordinary dreams of comfort and companionship. Rex remembered his mother's warmth during cold nights in the breeding kennel. Saber recalled the gentle hands of her first trainer before the military had taught her to see humans as either allies or targets. Tank's memories drifted back to a sunny afternoon when a young soldier had scratched his ears and called him a good boy just hours before the mortar attack changed everything. The concrete beneath them, stained with years of violence and marked by the evidence of failed rehabilitation attempts, began to feel different. What had been a prison was becoming a sanctuary. What had been a place of death was transforming into something unprecedented, a space where love was proving stronger than trauma, where a child's faith was healing wounds that professional psychiatrists had declared permanent. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, casting long shadows across their unlikely gathering, Lily Chun sat in the center of a miracle. 14 killing machines had become 14 broken souls seeking comfort. And somehow, impossibly, they had found it in the voice of a little girl who understood better than any adult that sometimes the most powerful medicine in the world was simply the willingness to sing to those who had forgotten how to hope. Animal Control Officer Jake Martinez arrived at the Riverside Military Canine Training Facility, expecting to find a crime scene. The frantic call from Mrs. Johnson had painted a nightmare scenario: a 7-year-old foster child missing for 4 hours, last seen heading toward the infamous death pen. Jake had worked with traumatized animals for 15 years, had witnessed every conceivable form of violence that dogs could inflict on humans, but nothing had prepared him for what he was about to discover. His hands shook as he fumbled with the heavy lock on the main gate, the keys slipping from his sweaty fingers twice before he managed to get the facility open. Behind him, a convoy of emergency vehicles waited, ambulances with trauma teams, police cars with officers who had already written off the child as a casualty, and even a helicopter circling overhead with a news crew who had caught wind of the story. The entire county was holding its breath, waiting for confirmation of what everyone believed was inevitable. Jake's radio crackled with updates as he made his way across the outer courtyard. "We've got the parents on scene," came the dispatcher's voice. "Foster mother is hysterical. Father is demanding to go in himself. Fire department is standing by with body bags." Each word hit Jake like a physical blow. He had tried to capture these dogs dozens of times over the past 3 years, had seen what they were capable of when cornered or threatened. No child could survive an encounter with Rex's pack. It was simply impossible. But as Jake rounded the corner of the main building, his radio slipped from his numb fingers and clattered to the concrete. His mind struggled to process what his eyes were seeing, because it violated every law of animal behavior he had ever learned. In the center of the exercise yard, surrounded by 14 of the most dangerous dogs in the continental United States, sat a small girl in a yellow sundress. She was not just alive, she was singing. Rex, the legendary pack leader who had sent 3 professional animal trainers to the hospital, was lying on his side with his massive head resting in Lily's lap. His yellow eyes, which had burned with homicidal fury during every previous encounter, were closed in what could only be described as bliss. The scars that crisscrossed his muzzle seemed less prominent somehow, as if the gentleness in his expression had softened even his most permanent wounds. Tank, a 120-pound monster who had once bitten through a tranquilizer pole, was sprawled on his back like an oversized puppy, his legs in the air and his tongue lolling out in a display of absolute trust and contentment. Saber, whose aggressive territorial behavior had made her untouchable even by veterinarians, was pressed against Lily's side with her eyes half closed in peaceful drowsiness. The entire pack had arranged themselves in a protective circle around the child, but not the kind of defensive formation Jake had witnessed during their hunting behavior. This was different. They were guarding her from the outside world, yes, but they were also guarding her peace, maintaining a respectful distance that allowed her to continue singing without interruption. When Ghost noticed Jake's arrival, the pale gray dog's ears perked up alertly, but instead of the aggressive stance Jake expected, Ghost simply positioned himself more prominently between Lily and the potential threat, his posture protective rather than predatory. Jake pulled out his cell phone with trembling hands and began recording, knowing that no one would believe what he was witnessing without visual proof. His 15 years of experience told him this was impossible. Dogs this traumatized didn't bond with strangers. Pack leaders didn't show vulnerability. Military working dogs retained their aggressive conditioning for life. It was basic animal psychology, backed by decades of research and thousands of documented cases. Yet here was living proof that everything he thought he knew about canine behavior was incomplete. Lily's voice rose and fell in a gentle melody that seemed to cast a spell over the entire facility. Even the afternoon breeze seemed to quiet itself, as if nature itself recognized the sanctity of what was happening. Jake found himself holding his breath, afraid that any sound might break the miraculous tableau before him. As he watched, Phantom, the dog who had been considered the most dangerous of the pack due to his unpredictable behavior, slowly crawled closer to Lily on his belly. The military working dog, who had once killed 2 insurgents in hand-to-hand combat, now approached like a penitent seeking absolution. When Lily reached out to stroke his scarred head, Phantom's one good eye closed and his entire body relaxed in a way that spoke of healing deeper than mere physical comfort. Jake's phone rang, breaking the spell momentarily. The dispatcher's voice was urgent. "Martinez, what's your status? Do we need the medical examiner?" But Jake couldn't find words to describe what he was seeing. How could he explain that the most feared pack in the state had transformed into gentle giants under the influence of a child's lullaby? How could he convey that these weapons of war were exhibiting behavior more docile than most household pets? "Stand down," he finally managed to whisper into the radio. "Repeat, stand down. The child is ... safe. More than safe. This is..." He struggled for words that didn't exist in his professional vocabulary. "This is a miracle." The response was immediate and predictable. "What's your status, Martinez? Are you injured? Do you need backup?" Jake looked at the scene before him, at Lily Chun sitting peacefully among 14 killing machines who had become her devoted guardians, at Rex's scarred face peaceful in sleep, at the concrete wasteland that had somehow become a sanctuary, and realized he was witnessing something that would change his understanding of animals, humans, and the mysterious connections that bound them together forever. Within 72 hours, Jake Martinez's shaky cell phone footage had exploded across social media with viral intensity that defied all algorithms. A grainy video showed something that challenged the fundamental understanding of animal behavior. Psychology: a small girl, surrounded by 14 of America's most dangerous military working dogs, all lying peacefully as she sang to them like they were beloved family pets. The footage accumulated over 50 million views in the first day alone, sparking debates that reached from veterinary schools to Pentagon briefing rooms. Dr. Sarah Williams, the preeminent animal behaviorist, whose textbooks were used in universities across 3 continents, stood before the emergency panel she had hastily assembled at Stanford University. Her reputation had been built on 30 years of rigorous scientific research, peer-reviewed studies that had defined modern understanding of canine trauma and rehabilitation. Now, watching Jake's video for the 100th time, she felt the foundations of her life's work crumbling beneath her feet. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dr. Williams addressed the gathering of experts, her voice tight with controlled confusion. "What we are witnessing here violates every established principle of animal psychology that we have spent decades proving. Military working dogs with documented PTSD do not exhibit spontaneous behavior reversals. Pack leaders do not surrender alpha status to unknown humans. Traumatized animals do not demonstrate this level of trust without extensive conditioning protocols." The panel included Dr. Marcus Chun from the Veterinary Neuropsychology Institute, Colonel Patricia Rodriguez, who had overseen military working dog training for the Department of Defense, and Dr. James Thompson, whose groundbreaking research on canine stress responses had earned him international recognition. Each expert had initially dismissed Jake's footage as elaborate fraud until 3 independent video analysis firms confirmed its authenticity using the most sophisticated detection software available. Colonel Rodriguez leaned forward, her military bearing unable to hide her bewilderment. I personally oversaw the trauma assessment of these animals 3 years ago. Rex alone was responsible for 17 documented aggressive incidents during his rehabilitation attempts. We classified him as permanently unfit for human contact. The psychological profiles indicated irreversible neurological damage from combat exposure. What this child has accomplished in minutes should have required months of intensive therapy, if it were possible at all. Dr. Thompson's laptop displayed brain scan comparisons from similar cases' heat maps showing the neurological signatures of chronic trauma in military working dogs. The amygdala hyperactivity we observe in these animals is a permanent condition. The fear response pathways become so deeply ingrained that they cannot be overridden by conventional methods. Yet this footage suggests an immediate neurological reset that our current understanding says is scientifically impossible. Meanwhile, at the facility itself, the impossible continued to unfold daily. Lily had returned every morning for the past week, always accompanied by Jake, and now a growing team of observers who maintained respectful distance. Each visit revealed new aspects of her inexplicable connection with the pack. The dogs didn't just tolerate her presence, they actively sought it out, displaying behaviors that contradicted decades of established research. Rex, the pack's undisputed alpha for 3 years, had begun deferring to Lily's gentle commands with an obedience that astounded everyone who witnessed it. When she whispered, "Sit," he lowered his massive frame immediately. When she said, "Stay," he remained motionless, even when other dogs approached. Most remarkably, when she sang, his stress indicators panting, scanning, muscle tension disappeared entirely, replaced by physiological markers associated with deep contentment. The other pack members had begun displaying equally unprecedented behaviors. Tank, whose aggression toward strangers had required specialized containment protocols, now approached new visitors calmly when Lily was present, as if her proximity provided a buffer against his trauma responses. Saber's damaged leg, which had caused her to favor aggressive defensive postures, showed improved mobility during Lily's visits, suggesting that psychological healing was manifesting in physical recovery. News outlets struggled to categorize the story. CNN's science correspondent called it potentially the most significant breakthrough in animal psychology since Pavlov's conditioning experiments. Fox News labeled it the miracle girl who tamed the untamable. International media picked up the story, with BBC producing a documentary proposal and National Geographic requesting exclusive access for a feature article. Dr. Williams found herself fielding calls from researchers worldwide, each proposing theories that sounded increasingly desperate. Perhaps the child possesses some form of pheromone signature that triggers maternal recognition responses, suggested one colleague. Another theorized about subsonic frequencies in her vocal patterns that stimulate parasympathetic nervous system activation. A controversial researcher from Japan proposed that Lily might represent an evolutionary adaptation for human-canine communication that bypasses learned aggression responses. But theories felt inadequate when confronted with daily evidence that transcended scientific explanation. Lily would arrive each morning, and the 14 warriors would gather around her like disciples around a teacher, their battle-scarred faces transformed by expressions of pure devotion. She would sing the same lullabies her mother had taught. Her and dogs who had forgotten how to trust would remember what safety felt like. The most disturbing aspect for the scientific community wasn't just that their expertise had been proven insufficient. It was that a 7-year-old child understood something about healing that their combined decades of research had missed entirely. Lily possessed no advanced degrees, had read no peer-reviewed studies on canine behavioral modification, knew nothing about neuroplasticity or conditional response theory. Yet she had accomplished what teams of experts had declared impossible. As Dr. Williams prepared her preliminary report for the American Veterinary Psychological Association, she realized she was documenting not just an anomaly, but a fundamental challenge to scientific orthodoxy. Somewhere in the mystery of Lily Chun's gift lay secrets about consciousness, connection, and healing that might revolutionize understanding of both human and animal psychology forever. 2 years after that life-changing afternoon in the death pen, the abandoned military facility had been transformed into something unrecognizable from its violent past. Where concrete walls once echoed with howls of rage and desperation, children's laughter now rang out across carefully tended gardens. The razor wire had been replaced with flowering vines. The blood-stained exercise yards converted into peaceful meditation spaces where the most traumatized animals in America learned to trust again. Lily's Haven, a center for miraculous healing. Read the bronze plaque beside the main entrance, but the name barely captured the revolution that had taken place within these walls. What had begun as one impossible moment between a girl and 14 war dogs had evolved into a worldwide movement that was rewriting the fundamental understanding of trauma recovery, interspecies communication, and the mysterious power of unconditional love. Rex, the former pack leader whose scarred face had once inspired terror in seasoned professionals, now wore a specially designed therapy vest as he gently nuzzled a wheelchair-bound veteran suffering from severe PTSD, Master Sergeant David Coleman, who had lost both legs to an IED in Syria, wept openly as the massive German shepherd rested his head on his lap, the same head that had once been trained to kill enemies, now providing comfort to a fellow warrior who understood the cost of survival. "He knows," Coleman whispered to Dr. Sarah Williams, who had become the facility's chief researcher after abandoning her previous theories about impossible animal behavior. "He understands what I've been through, because he's been there too." There's no judgment in his eyes, no pity, just recognition. Rex's transformation from killer to healer had become the centerpiece of a revolutionary therapy program that paired traumatized veterans with equally traumatized military working dogs, creating healing partnerships that benefited both species. Tank had found his calling with a different population entirely. The massive dog who had once required specialized containment protocols now spent his days in the children's wing, where young cancer patients undergoing chemotherapy found strength in stroking his battle-scarred coat. 8-year-old Maria Santos, bald from treatment but radiant with hope, had nicknamed him Teddy Bear, despite his intimidating size. "He's been hurt like me," she explained to her amazed parents, "but he got better, so I will too." Saber's damaged leg, which had healed remarkably under Lily's influence, had made her the perfect companion for children with physical disabilities. Her visible scars and slight limp created instant connection with young people who felt different from their peers. 12-year-old Marcus Williams, born with cerebral palsy, had made unprecedented progress in his physical therapy sessions with Saber by his side, the dog's patient presence giving him confidence to push beyond his perceived limitations. The facility's success had attracted attention from medical institutions worldwide. The Mayo Clinic had partnered with Lily's Haven to study the neurological mechanisms behind the healing connections they were witnessing. Harvard Medical School was conducting research on the biochemical changes observed in both humans and animals. During their therapy sessions, the Department of Veterans Affairs had designated the facility as their primary research site for alternative PTSD treatments. But the most remarkable transformation belonged to Lily herself. Now 9 years old, she moved through the facility with the quiet confidence of someone who had discovered her life's purpose at an impossibly young age. Her foster parents, the Johnsons, had officially adopted her, creating the stable family foundation that allowed her gift to flourish. She spent every afternoon after school at the Haven, working with new arrivals who needed her special touch. A Lilly method, as researchers had dubbed her approach, had been studied, documented, and partially replicated by trained professionals around the world. Music therapy programs incorporated her lullaby techniques. Veterinary schools added courses on intuitive animal communication. Child psychology programs examined her natural ability to connect with traumatized creatures through pure empathy, rather than clinical intervention. Yet even as scientists worked to understand and systematize her gift, Lilly remained remarkably unchanged by her celebrity status. She had turned down television interviews, book deals, and Hollywood movie offers, preferring to focus on the animals who still needed her help. "They don't care if I'm famous," she explained to a persistent reporter. "They just need someone to sing to them until they remember they're safe." The ripple effects of that October afternoon continued expanding in ways no one could have predicted. Military protocols for handling traumatized working dogs had been completely revised, based on observations from Lilly's Haven. Animal shelters across the country had implemented gentleness programs inspired by her methods. A new generation of veterinarians was being trained to look beyond behavioral symptoms to the emotional wounds that lay beneath aggressive responses. Ghost had become the facility's ambassador, his pale gray coat and gentle demeanor making him the perfect representative for media visits and educational programs. Schools brought children to meet the former warrior, who now spent his days teaching young people about the healing power of patience and understanding. His transformation from invisible killer to visible symbol of hope embodied everything this new Haven represented. As evening fell on another successful day, Lilly sat in the central courtyard surrounded by dozens of success stories, dogs who had found new purpose, veterans who had found peace, children who had found strength. The 14 original pack members, now scattered across various therapy programs, but still deeply bonded to their young savior, gathered around her as she began her evening ritual. Her voice rose in the familiar melody that had started it all, the lullaby that had somehow bridged the gap between trauma and healing, between human and animal, between despair and hope. Other voices joined her staff members, visiting families, even some of the veteran patients who had found their own healing in these sacred walls. The death pen was truly dead, replaced by something unprecedented in the annals of human-animal relations. In its place stood living proof that sometimes the greatest healing comes not from expertise or technology, but from a child's willingness to see past the scars to the gentle souls waiting underneath, ready to remember what love feels like when given the chance to trust again.